Chapter 1 of Book 13 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patricia Hayes. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 13, Marius Enters the Shadow. Chapter 1, From the Rue Plumet to the Quartier Saint-Denis. The voice which had summoned Marius through the twilight of the barricade of the Rue de la Chanvrerie had produced on him the effect of the voice of destiny. He wished to die. The opportunity presented itself. He knocked at the door of the tomb. A hand in the darkness offered him the key. These melancholy openings which take place in the gloom before despair are tempting. Marius thrust aside the bar which had so often allowed him to pass, emerged from the garden, and said, "I will go." Mad with grief, no longer conscious of anything fixed or solid in his brain, incapable of accepting anything thenceforth of the fate after those 2 months passed in the intoxication of youth and love, overwhelmed at once by all the reveries of despair, he had but one desire remaining, to make a speedy end of all. He set out at rapid pace. He found himself most opportunely armed, as he had Javert's pistols with him. The young man of whom he thought he had caught a glimpse had vanished from his sight in the street. Marius, who had emerged from the Rue Plumet by the boulevard, traversed the Esplanade and the bridge of the Invalides, the Champs-Élysées, the Place Louis XV, and reached the Rue de Rivoli. The shops were open there. The gas was burning under the arcades. Women were making their purchases in the stalls. People were eating ices in the café latte and nibbling small cakes at the English pastry cook's shop. Only a few posting-chaises were setting out at a gallop from the Hôtel des Princes and the Hôtel Meurice. Marius entered the Rue Saint-Honoré through the Passage Delorme. There the shops were closed. The merchants were chatting in front of their half-open doors. People were walking about. The street lanterns were lighted. Beginning with the first floor, all the windows were lighted as usual. There was cavalry on the Place du Palais Royal. Marius followed the Rue Saint-Honoré in proportion as he left the Palais Royal behind him. There were fewer lighted windows. The shops were fast shut. No one was chatting on the thresholds. The street grew sombre, and at the same time the crowd increased in density. For the passers-by now amounted to a crowd. No one could be seen to speak in this throng, and yet there arose from it a dull, deep murmur. Near the fountain of the Arbre Sec there were assemblages, motionless and gloomy groups, which were to those who went and came as stones in the midst of running water. At the entrance of the Rue des Prouvaires, the crowd no longer walked. It formed a resisting, massive, solid, compact, almost impenetrable block of people who were huddled together and conversing in low tones. There were hardly any black coats or round hats now, but smock frocks, blouses, caps, and bristling and cadaverous heads. This multitude undulated confusedly in the nocturnal gloom. Its whisperings had the hoarse accent of a vibration. Although not one of them was walking, a dull trampling was audible in the mire. Beyond this dense portion of the throng, in the Rue du Roule, and the Rue des Prouvaires, and the extension of the Rue Saint-Honoré, there were no longer a single window in which a candle was burning. Only the solitary and diminishing rows of lanterns could be seen vanishing into the street in the distance. The lanterns of that date resembled large red stars hanging to ropes and shed upon the pavement a shadow which had the form of a huge spider. These streets were not deserted. There could be descried piles of guns, moving bayonets, and troops bivouacking. No curious observer passed that limit. Their circulation ceased. There the rabble ended, and the army began. Marius willed with the will of a man who hopes no more. He had been summoned, he must go. He found a means to traverse the throng and pass the bivouac of the troops. He shunned the patrols, he avoided the sentinels, he made a circuit, reached the Rue de Béthesy, and directed his course toward the Halles. At the corner of the Rue des Bourdonnais, there were no longer any lanterns. After having passed the zone of the crowd, he had passed the limits of the troops. He found himself in something startling. There was no longer a passer-by, no longer a soldier, no longer a light. There was no one. Solitude, silence, night. I know not chill which seized upon one. Entering a street was like entering a cellar. He continued to advance. He took a few steps. Someone passed close to him at a run. Was it a man or a woman? Were there many of them? He could not have told. It had passed and vanished. Proceeding from circuit to circuit, he reached a lane which he judged to be the Rue de la Poterie. Near the middle of this street, he came in contact with an obstacle. He extended his hands. It was an overturned wagon. His foot recognized pools of water, gullies, and paving stones scattered and piled up. A barricade had been begun there and abandoned. He climbed over the stones and found himself on the other side of the barrier. He walked very near the street posts and guided himself along the walls of the houses. A little beyond the barricade, it seemed to him that he could make out something white in front of him. He approached. It took on a form. It was two white horses, the horses of the omnibus, harnessed by Bossuet in the morning, who had been straying at random all day from street to street, and had finally halted there, with the weary patience of brutes who no more understand the actions of men than man understands the actions of Providence. Marius left the horses behind him. As he was approaching a street, which seemed to him to be the Rue du Centre Social, a shot, coming no one knows whence, and traversing the darkness at random, whistled close by him, and the bullet pierced a brass shaving dish suspended above his head over a hairdresser's shop. This pierced shaving dish was still to be seen in 1848 in the Rue du Centre Social, at the corner of the pillars of the market. This shot still betokened life. From that instant forth, he encountered nothing more. The whole of this itinerary resembled a descent of black steps. Nevertheless, Marius pressed forward. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. An Owl's View of Paris. A being who could have hovered over Paris that night with the wing of the bat or the owl would have had beneath his eyes a gloomy spectacle. All that old quarter of the Halles, which is like a city within a city, through which run the Rues Saint-Denis and Saint-Martin, where 1,000 lanes cross, and of which the insurgents had made their redoubt and their stronghold, would have appeared to him like a dark and enormous cavity hollowed out in the centre of Paris. There the glance fell into an abyss. Thanks to the broken lanterns, thanks to the closed windows, there all radiance, all life, all sound, all movement ceased. The invisible police of the insurrection were on the watch everywhere, and maintained order, that is to say, night. The necessary tactics of insurrection are to drown small numbers in a vast obscurity, to multiply every combatant by the possibilities which that obscurity contains. At dusk, every window where a candle was burning received a shot. The light was extinguished. Sometimes the inhabitant was killed. Hence, nothing was stirring. There was nothing but fright, mourning, stupor in the houses, and in the streets a sort of sacred horror. Not even the long rows of windows in stores, the indentations of the chimneys and the roofs, and the vague reflections which are cast back by the wet and muddy pavements were visible. An eye cast upward at that mass of shadows might, perhaps, have caught a glimpse here and there, at intervals, of indistinct gleams which brought out broken and eccentric lines and profiles of singular buildings, something like the lights which go and come in ruins. It was at such points that the barricades were situated. The rest was a lake of obscurity, foggy, heavy, and funereal, above which, in motionless and melancholy outlines, rose the tower of Saint Jacques, and the church of Saint Merry, and two or three more of those grand edifices of which man makes giants and the night makes phantoms. All around this deserted and disquieting labyrinth, in the quarters where the Parisian circulation had not been annihilated, and where a few street lanterns still burned, the aerial observer might have distinguished the metallic gleam of swords and bayonets, the dull rumble of artillery, and the swarming of silent battalions whose ranks were swelling from minute to minute, a formidable girdle which was slowly drawing in and around the insurrection. The invested quarter was no longer anything more than a monstrous cavern. Everything there appeared to be asleep or motionless, and as we have just seen, any street which one might come to offered nothing but darkness. A wild darkness, full of traps, full of unseen and formidable shocks, into which it was alarming to penetrate and in which it was terrible to remain, where those who entered shivered before those they awaited, where those who waited shuddered before those who were coming. Invisible combatants were entrenched at every corner of the street. Snares of the sepulchre were concealed in the density of night. All was over. No more light was to be hoped for. Henceforth, except the lightning of guns, no further encounter except the abrupt and rapid apparition of death. Where, how, when, no one knew, but it was certain and inevitable. In this place, which had been marked out for the struggle, the government and the insurrection, the National Guard and popular societies, the bourgeois and the uprising, groping their way, were about to come into contact. The necessity was the same for both. The only possible issue thenceforth was to emerge thence killed or conquerors. A situation so extreme, an obscurity so powerful, that the most timid felt themselves seized with resolution, and the most daring with terror. Moreover, on both sides, the fury, the rage, and the determination were equal. For the one party to advance meant death, and no one dreamed of retreating. For the other, to remain meant death, and no one dreamed of flight. It was indispensable that all should be ended on the following day, that triumph should rest either here or there, that the insurrection should prove itself a revolution or a skirmish. The government understood this as well as the parties. The most insignificant bourgeois felt it. Hence a thought of anguish, which mingled with the impenetrable gloom of this quarter where all was at the point of being decided. Hence a redoubled anxiety around the silence whence a catastrophe was on the point of emerging. Here only one sound was audible, a sound as heart-rending as the death rattle, as menacing as a malediction, the tocsin of Saint Merry. Nothing could be more blood-curdling than the clamor of the wild and desperate bell, wailing amid the shadows. As it often happens, nature seemed to have fallen into accord with what men were about to do. Nothing disturbed the harmony of the whole effect. The stars had disappeared. Heavy clouds filled the horizon with their melancholy folds. A black sky rested on these dead streets, as though an immense winding sheet were being outspread over this immense tomb. While a battle that was still wholly political was in preparation in the same locality which had already witnessed so many revolutionary events, while youth, the secret associations, the schools in the name of principles, and the middle classes in the name of interest, were approaching preparatory to dashing themselves together, clasping and throwing each other, while each one hastened and invited the last and decisive hour of the crisis. Far away, And quite outside of this fatal quarter, in the most profound depths of the unfathomable cavities of that wretched old Paris, which disappears under the splendor of happy and opulent Paris, the sombre voice of the people could be heard giving utterance to a dull roar. A fearful and sacred voice, which is composed of the roar of the brute and of the word of God, which terrifies the weak and warns the wise, which comes both from below like the voice of the lion, and from on high like the voice of the thunder. End of Book 13, Chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 3 of Book 13 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patricia Hayes. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel, Florence, Hapgood. Book 13. Marius enters the shadow. Chapter 3. Marius had reached the Halles. There everything was still calmer, more obscure and more motionless than in the neighboring streets. One would have said that the glacial peace of the sepulchre had sprung forth from the earth, and had spread over the heavens. Nevertheless, a red glow brought out against this black background the lofty roofs of the houses which barred the Rue de la Chanvrerie on the Saint Eustache side. It was the reflection of the torch which was burning in the Corinthe barricade. Marius directed his steps toward that red light. It had drawn him to the Marshal Pourri, and he caught a glimpse of the dark mouth of the Rue des Prêcheurs. He entered it. The insurgent sentinel who was guarding the other end did not see him. He felt that he was very close to that which he had come in search of, and he walked on tiptoe. In this manner he reached the elbow of that short section of the Rue Mondétour, which was, as the reader will remember, the only communication which Enjolras had preserved with the outside world. At the corner of the last house on his left, he thrust his head forward and looked into the fragment of the Rue Mondétour. A little beyond the angle of the lane and the Rue de la Chanvrerie, which cast a broad curtain of shadow, in which he was himself engulfed, he perceived some light on the pavement, a bit of the wine shop, and beyond, a flickering lamp within a sort of shapeless wall, and men crouching down with guns on their knees. All this was 10 fathoms distant from him. It was the interior of the barricade. The houses which bordered the lane on the right concealed the rest of the wine shop, the large barricade, and the flag from him. Marius had but a step more to take. Then the unhappy man seated himself on a post, folded his arms, and fell to thinking about his father. He thought of that heroic Colonel Pontmercy, who had been so proud a soldier, who had guarded the frontier of France under the Republic, and had touched the frontier of Asia under Napoleon, who had beheld Genoa, Alexandria, Milan, Turin, Madrid, Vienna, Dresden, Berlin, Moscow, who had left on all the victorious battlefields of Europe drops of that same blood which he, Marius, had in his veins, who had grown gray before his time in discipline and command, who had lived with his sword belt buckled, his epaulets falling on his breast, his cockade blackened with powder, his brow furrowed with his helmet, in barracks, in camp, in the bivouac, in ambulances, and who, at the expiration of 20 years, had returned from the great wars with a scarred cheek, a smiling countenance, tranquil, admirable, pure as a child, having done everything for France, and nothing against her. He said to himself that his day had also come now, that his hour had struck, that following his father, he too was about to show himself brave, intrepid, bold, to run to meet the bullets, to offer his breast to bayonets, to shed his blood, to seek the enemy, to seek death, that he was about to wage war in his turn and descend to the field of battle, and that the field of battle upon which he was to descend was the street, and that the war in which he was about to engage was civil war. He beheld civil war laid open like a gulf before him, and into this he was about to fall. Then he shuddered. He thought of his father's sword, which his grandfather had sold to a second-hand dealer, and which he had so mournfully regretted. He said to himself that that chaste and valiant sword had done well to escape from him and to depart in wrath into the gloom, that if it had thus fled, it was because it was intelligent, and because it had foreseen the future, that it had had a presentiment of this rebellion, the war of the gutters, the war of pavements, fusillades through cellar windows, blows given and received in the rear. It was because, coming from Marengo and Friedland, it did not wish to go to the Rue de la Chanvrerie. It was because, after what it had done with the father, it did not wish to do this for the son. He told himself that if that sword were there, if after taking possession of it at his father's pillow, he had dared to take it and carry it off for this combat of darkness between Frenchmen in the streets, it would assuredly have scorched his hands and burst out of flame before his eyes, like the sword of the angel. He told himself that it was fortunate that it was not there, that it had disappeared, that that was well, that that was just, that his grandfather had been the true guardian of his father's glory, and that it was far better that the colonel's sword should be sold at auction, sold to the old clothes man, thrown among the old junk, than it should today wound the side of his country. And then he fell to weeping bitterly. This was horrible. But what was he to do? Live without Cosette he could not. Since she was gone, he must needs die. Had he not given her his word of honor that he would die? She had gone knowing that. This meant that it pleased her that Marius should die, and then it was clear that she no longer loved him, since she had departed thus without warning, without a word, without a letter, although she knew his address. What was the good of living, and why should he live now? Then what? Should he retreat after going so far? Should he flee from danger after having approached it? Should he slip away after having come and peeped into the barricade? Slip away, all in a tremble, saying, "After all, I have had enough of it as it is. I have seen it. That suffices. This is civil war, and I shall take my leave." Should he abandon his friends who were expecting, who were in need of him possibly, who were a mere handful against an army? Should he be untrue at once to his love, to country, to his word? Should he give to his cowardice the pretext of patriotism? But this was impossible. And if the phantom of his father was there in the gloom and beheld him retreating, he would beat him on the loins with the flat of his sword and shout to him, "March on, you poltroon!" Thus, a prey to the conflicting movements of his thoughts, he dropped his head. All at once he raised it. A sort of splendid rectification had just been effected in his mind. There is a widening of the sphere of thought which is peculiar to the vicinity of the grave. It makes one see clearly to be near death. The vision of the action into which he felt that he was, perhaps, on the point of entering, appeared to him no more as lamentable, but as superb. The war of the street was suddenly transfigured by some unfathomable inward working of his soul, before the eye of his thought. All the tumultuous interrogation points of reverie recurred to him in throngs, but without troubling him. He left none of them unanswered. Let us see. Why should his father be indignant? Are there not cases where insurrection rises to the dignity of duty? What was there that was degrading for the son of Colonel Pontmercy in the combat which was about to begin? It is no longer Montmirail nor Champaubert. It is something quite different. The question is no longer one of sacred territory, but of a holy idea. The country wails, that may be, but humanity applauds. But is it true that the country does wail? France bleeds, but liberty smiles, and in the presence of liberty's smile, France forgets her wound. And then, if we look at things from a still more lofty point of view, why do we speak of civil war? Civil war, what does that mean? Is there a foreign war? Is not all war between men war between brothers? War is qualified only by its object. There is no such thing as foreign or civil war. There is only just and unjust war. Until that day when the grand human agreement is concluded, war, that at least which is the effort of the future, which is hastening on against the past, which is lagging in the rear, may be necessary. What have we to reproach that war with? War does not become a disgrace. The sword does not become a disgrace except when it is used for assassinating the right, progress, reason, civilization, truth. Then war, whether foreign or civil, is iniquitous. It is called crime. Outside the pale of that holy thing, justice, by what right does one form of man despise another? By what right should the sword of Washington disown the pike of Camille Desmoulins? Leonidas against the stranger, Timoleon against the tyrant, which is greater? The one is the defender, the other the liberator. Shall we brand every appeal to arms within a city limits without taking the object into a consideration? Then note the infamy of Brutus, Marcel, Arnold von Blankenheim, calling the hedgerow war. War of the streets. Why not? That was the war of Ambiorix, of Artevelde, of Marny, of Pelagius. But Ambiorix fought against Rome, Artevelde against France, Marny against Spain, Pelagius against the Moors, all against the foreigner. Well, the monarchy is a foreigner. Oppression is a stranger. The right divine is a stranger. Despotism violates the moral frontier. And invasion violates geographical frontier. Driving out the tyrant or driving out the English, in both cases regaining possession of one's own territory. There comes an hour when protestation no longer suffices. After philosophy, action is required. Live force finishes what the idea has sketched out. Prometheus chained begins. Aristoteton begins. The encyclopedia enlightens souls. The 10th of August electrifies them. After Aeschylus, Thrasybulus. After Diderot, Danton. Multitudes have a tendency to accept the master. Their mass bears witness to apathy. A crowd is easily led as a whole to obedience. Men must be stirred up, pushed on, treated roughly by the very benefit of their deliverance. Their eyes must be wounded by the true. Light must be hurled at them in terrible handfuls. They must be a little thunderstruck themselves at their own well-being. This dazzling awakens them. Hence the necessity of tocsins and wars. Great combatants must rise, must enlighten nations with audacity, and shake up that sad humanity which is covered with gloom by the right divine, Caesarean glory, force, fanaticism, irresponsible power, and absolute majesty. A rabble stupidly occupied in the contemplation, in their twilight splendor, of these sombre triumphs of the night. Down with the tyrant! Of whom are you speaking? Do you call Louis Philippe the tyrant? No, no more than Louis XVI. Both of them are what history is in the habit of calling good kings. But principles are not to be parcelled out. The logic of the true is rectilinear. The peculiarity of truth is that it lacks complacence. No concessions. Then all encroachments on man should be repressed. There is a divine right in Louis XVI. There is because of Bourbon in Louis Philippe. Both represent in a certain measure the confiscation of right. And in order to clear away universal insurrection, they must be combated. It must be done, France being always the one to begin. When the master falls in France, he falls everywhere. In short, What cause is more just, and consequently what war is greater, than that which reestablishes social truth, restores throne to liberty, restores the people to the people, restores sovereignty to man, replaces the purple on the head of France, restores equity and reason in their plenitude, suppresses every germ of antagonism by restoring each one to himself, annihilates the obstacle which royalty presents to the whole immense universal concord, and places the human race once more on a level with the right. These wars build up peace, an enormous fortress of prejudices, privileges, superstitions, lies, exactions, abuses, violences, iniquities, and darkness still stand erect in this world with its towers of hatred. It must be cast down. This monstrous mass must be made to crumble. To conquer at Austerlitz is grand. To take the Bastille is immense. There is no one who has not noticed it in his own case, the soul, and therein lies the marvel of its unity complicated with ubiquity, has a strange aptitude for reasoning almost coldly in the most violent extremities, and it often happens that heart-broken passion and profound despair in the very agony of their blackest monologues treat subjects and discuss theses. Logic is mingled with convulsion, and the thread of syllogism floats, without breaking, in the mournful storm of thought. This was the situation of Marius' mind. As he meditated thus, dejected but resolute, hesitating in every direction, and in short shuddering at what he was about to do, his glance strayed to the interior of the barricade. The insurgents were there conversing in a low voice, without moving, and there was perceptible that quasi-silence which marks the last stage of expectation. Overhead, at the small window in the third story, Marius descried a sort of spectator who appeared to him to be singularly attentive. This was the porter who had been killed by Le Cabuc. Below, by the lights of the torch which was thrust between the paving stones, this head could be vaguely distinguished. Nothing could be stranger in that sombre and uncertain gleam than that vivid, motionless, astonished face, with its bristling hair, its eyes fixed and staring, and its yawning mouth bent over the street in an attitude of curiosity. One would have said that the man who was dead was surveying those who were about to die. A long trail of blood which had flowed from that head descended in reddish threads from the window to the height of the first floor, where it stopped. End of Book 13, Chapter 3.